When you think about businesses that are selling through the roof, like Aloe or Allbirds, sure, you think about a great product, a cool brand, and great marketing. But an often overlooked secret is actually the businesses behind the business, making selling, and for shoppers, buying, simple. For millions of businesses, that business is Shopify. Nobody does online business better than Shopify. It's home of Shop Pay, the #1 checkout in the world. You can use it to boost conversions up to 50%, meaning way less carts going abandoned and way more sales going through to checkout. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/income, all lowercase. Go to shopify.com/income to upgrade your selling today. That's shopify.com/income.
The Presidencies of the United States is a proud member of the Evergreen Podcast Network. Hello and welcome to the Presidencies of the United States. I'm your host, Jerry Landry. This is the conclusion of our 3-part Seat at the Table episode on John Quincy Adams. If for some reason you were so eager to just find out how we ranked him at the end that you skipped right to part 3, may I please encourage you to go back and listen to parts 1 and 2 before proceeding further. For those of you who have been on this journey with us to date, you know that we left off with John Quincy Adams leaving office as Secretary of State to assume the presidency. Believe me, the next 23 years of his life are just as fascinating and action-packed as the 57 leading up to his presidency. Before we get to that, though, I'd like to say a special thanks to Ilsa and Chris of the Flat Pack History of Sweden and Kingdom podcast. On the former, they are examining Swedish history from its prehistoric beginnings on up to the present day. This led them to launch the second podcast, Kingdom, which looks at the Swedish monarchs and evaluates them in the Rexipod format. The stakes are high for the monarchs, however, as the ones who don't measure up can get squished into a meatball. You can find a Flat Pack History of Sweden and Kingdom anywhere you get your podcast, or you can go to their website, a Flat Pack History of Sweden, all one word.com. I'll have a link on the page for this episode on my website, presidenciespodcast.com. Ilsa and Chris are not only amazing podcasters, but wonderful friends. So please be sure to check out their podcast once you're done with this episode. With that said, let's wrap up this series on John Quincy's life and career. So, again, don't want to go into too much detail because we will be covering this quite extensively.
I was going to say, this is when you play your 25 episode series about John Quincy Adams, and we just sit here for a couple of days listening.
Exactly. But I did want to point out a few points that we'll go into, as we're ranking him at the end, related to his overall legacy and potential disgrace. So one of the first issues that the new president and his administration had to deal with were the Muskogee, who were also known as the Creek. They had signed a new treaty with the United States at the tail end of the Monroe presidency, but as with most treaties signed with Native peoples, it was negotiated under less than honorable circumstances and ceded lands that were not necessarily the negotiators to cede. Now, while Adams and his administration did treat with the Muskogee who came to plead their case with them as if they were a separate nation, Adams also felt that nothing, quote, could stop the tidal force of Western settlement. The administration went back and forth in 1825 between the Muskogee and the government of Georgia, trying to work out terms to which they could both agree, which meant that the land the Muskogee would retain was less and less with each proposed agreement. So that'll be something to consider at the end. Now, Adams and his Secretary of State, Henry Clay, would spend a good deal of time, quote, worrying about Cuba, which seemed equally threatened by revolution or by conquest. They would even send a secret agent, quote, to look into the island's wealth and resources, its capacity to resist foreign invasion, and the disposition of its inhabitants in regard to independence or annexation by one of the republics. Adams would push for greater American engagement with Latin America through his push to send delegates to the Pan American Congress, as the United States had been invited to attend. But as Trobe wrote, quote, the Pan American Congress, was to be Adams's Waterloo. So here we're back at Waterloo again.
Love it.
This fight over sending delegates to the Congress would ultimately lead to a duel between Secretary of State Clay and Senator John Randolph of Roanoke and do irreparable damage to the administration's reputation. And ultimately, it really came to naught. There were delegates sent, but one refused to depart due to a fear of yellow fever, another died while en route, and the third arrived after the Congress had ended.
Great job.
Great job. So after a hard-fought contest, which was noted for its, quote, sheer vileness and dishonesty, with both the Adams and Jackson camps getting down in the mud, Adams lost his re-election bid in a decisive victory for Jackson. But beyond just the disappointment of being rejected by the nation, Adams also had to worry about how he was going to sustain himself and his family financially in a time when former presidents did not receive a stipend.
And sort of 27 kids and cousins and everyone else who he's looking after.
Exactly. I mean, he's got a lot going on, and he's like, now he's out of a job. So he leaves office. They have a new house called Meridian Hill, and he kind of goes there for a little bit. He did receive a visit from the incoming Secretary of State, Martin Van Buren, but the rest of the incoming Jackson administration did their best to pretend that John Quincy Adams did not exist.
It was probably because Van Buren just wanted to know about John Quincy's time in the Netherlands.
or can you tell me about this filing system that you set up? Now, sadly, the family soon experienced tragedy when John and Louisa's oldest son, George Washington Adams, died by suicide on the early morning of April 30th when he jumped from a steamer in Long Island Sound in a delusional state. So it has been a rough place for this family. And, John Quincy's still trying to figure out what he wants to do. So the former president traveled to Quincy that June. He thought about writing a biography of his father, but ultimately that didn't come to anything. But he would start to grow close with his son, Charles, so the youngest son. He would become John Quincy's closest confidant, much as John Quincy had been to his own father, and Charles would prove to be his father's partner in managing his business affairs, as his other son, John Adams II, the one who had been kicked out of Harvard, had proven untrustworthy. So Charles is now the one who's really the reliable one. So they're still kind of going back and forth. They've still got their home in D.C., so they still go there for a bit. They go back to Quincy for a while. But while attending a reception during the celebration of Boston's 200th anniversary in mid-September 1830, Adams was approached by Edward Everett about the possibility of Adams standing for election in the Massachusetts 8th Congressional District. Now, Adams would not campaign, his friends would do the work, but on December 6th, he was elected to the seat by a vote of 1,817 of 2,545 votes. So an overwhelming victory. Now, Louisa and Charles had been against his candidacy, but Adams agreed to serve when he was elected, and at the end of the year traveled to Washington, despite the fact that he wouldn't assume a seat until December 1831. But he was like, I want to get back, want to get a start on what am I going to do next year?
and just his title, so he's Congressman President Adams.
Exactly. Exactly. And at this time, there would be much for him to throw himself into. July 4th, he accepted an invitation from his hometown of Quincy, Massachusetts, to deliver an address to celebrate the 55th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. He used this as an opportunity to attack the concept of nullification, which was being promoted by Vice President Calhoun and other South Carolina leaders at the time. He also attended the anti-Masonic convention in Massachusetts that year, as he was growing interested in that growing movement. But finally, in mid-November, he departed from Quincy, and on December 5th, he was sworn in as a U.S. representative, the first and to date only former president to serve in that body in their post-presidency. So Adams, of course, being John Quincy Adams, He positioned himself during this tenure in Congress, much as he had during his Senate tenure, quote, as a party of one. Now, while he was nominally aligned first with the National Republicans and then with the Whigs, when the National Republicans and anti-Masons joined forces, he really sought a middle path. His name was put forward as the anti-Masonic nominee for president in 1832, but ultimately William Wirt, who had served as Adams's Attorney General, had gotten that nomination. But the Massachusetts Anti-Masonic Party named Adams in September 1833 as their nominee for governor, but the three-way race resulted in none of the candidates winning a majority of the vote, and the state assembly would have to choose the next governor. But Adams, instead of the repeat of 1824, he was like, you know what, I'm just out of it. I'll just stay in the House of Representatives. But on December 18th, 1835, something would happen in the House that would lead to what became Adams's greatest legacy during his tenure in Congress. Because a representative from Massachusetts, William Jackson, quote, introduced a petition from his constituents asking Congress to prohibit slavery and the slave trade in the District of Columbia. Now, to this point, petitions have been presented in Congress without question. But given the topic of the petition, Representative James Henry Hammond of South Carolina objected and, quote, proposed that the House refuse to receive Jackson's petition or any other asking Congress to act on the subject of slavery. 3 days later, Adams rose to deliver his remarks objecting to any action to refuse to receive petitions, especially since other similar petitions had been introduced by him and other representatives with no action being taken on them. Why silence the voice of the people? Because this would only push people harder on the subject of abolition. Besides the fact that the right to petition Congress was in the Constitution. Congress could not deny the people's constitutional rights. Now, despite these arguments, the House passed the gag rule by a vote of 117 to 68 in late May. Adams would become the champion of fighting the gag rule. As Trobe describes, quote, Adams increasingly became the hero and standard bearer of the abolitionist movement, even though he opposed immediacism and the prohibition of slavery in the District of Columbia. But because he was fighting the gag rule, and because the gag rule was in place because of slavery, he was seen as being the champion of abolition. Also in this is this idea of Texas annexation, because Adams took up a new cause in opposing Texas annexation because he realized that all of this was in together. Even though he had wanted to fill in the map, he knew Texas was going to come in as a slave state. That was going to take power from New England and the free states. There was so much involved with this. And so all these issues just start to roll together for him. Now, in something that we haven't seen thus far in this series or in the narrative series, Representative Adams began to receive death threats from Southerners. As described by Trobe, quote, slaveholders seem to have persuaded themselves and one another that by killing Adams, they could scotch the snake of abolitionism. This did not stop John Adams. He kept fighting forward. He kept fighting against the spread of slavery. He kept fighting against the gag rule. But another major moment in Adams's legacy came in September 1839 when he read an account of the imprisonment of the Amistad captives. So these were people who had been enslaved illegally, and the ship ended up in U.S. custody. They were petitioning the courts. There's a whole long, I don't want to go too far down the rabbit hole of this, but basically they were fighting in the courts for their freedom, their rights to freedom. And on September 23rd, an abolitionist in Boston, Ellis Gray Loring, wrote to Adams about the case and asked his opinion. Though Adams was cautious at first, Trobe asserts that, quote, even at this early stage, it's clear that prudence notwithstanding, he yearned to play a role in the Amistad defense. In late October 1840, Adams was approached to join the legal team to represent the Amistad captives as their case was going to the Supreme Court. And again, initially reluctant, but he ultimately agreed. In late February and early March 1841, Adams delivered the closing argument for the defense before the Supreme Court. As Trobe describes, with his words, quote, he was seeking to summon these 9 men to the realm of timeless truth and morality. This was what Adams could do as no other advocate could. And indeed, the odds were stacked against him. 5 of the 9 on the Supreme Court were enslavers. 7 had been appointed by Jackson. On March 9th, the court returned their verdict. They ruled for the defense. The Amistad captives were finally free. So this becomes a big part of Adams's legacy.
Yeah, I was going to say they talked a lot about it when I went to the Heritage Park and the house, and it's easy to see this guy as, oh, he was a president, and a lot of this stuff, the sort of some of the longer lasting legacies come with this sort of thing afterwards. So.
Yeah. Now, Adams would keep on the fight, but he was starting to slow down as he got older. Finally, on December 3rd, 1844, he got the victory that he had been waiting for when his motion to end the gag rule was passed by a vote of 108 to 80. Now, he didn't actually win with the idea on Texas annexation. That did go through, but, he was still at least able to achieve victory against the gag rule. But time was starting to take its toll on Adams. But he at least outlived Andrew Jackson. When he learned of Jackson's demise, Adams summed him up with the following words, quote, Jackson was a hero, a murderer, an adulterer, who in the last days of his life belied and slandered me before the world and died.
Yeah. He was a great chap.
He was a great chap, and I couldn't stand him. But his health just continued to decline. He was starting to get more frail in his manner and appearance. It was really getting bad. But he persisted. Even when he was having trouble getting out of bed, he still insisted on going to the house. He was like, this is my job. This is what I have to do. He ended up suffering what are perceived to probably be strokes. He kept recovering, but it was just really starting to wear on him. But he continued. He kept on going to Congress. On February 21st, 1848, Adams went to the House chamber and took his seat. In the midst of a vote call for a resolution to, quote, commend veterans of recent battles in the Mexican-American War, a war which John Quincy Adams opposed, Adams weakly voted no. Then, when he tried to rise to speak, quote, as a deep flush suffused his temples, he clutched at his desk and began to topple. Members of the House shouted a warning, and a colleague caught him before he struck the floor. Adams was carried to a sofa and then to the private chambers of the Speaker of the House. This would become his sick room for the next couple of days. Funny enough, he did not recognize his wife when she was brought to his side, but he did recognize Senator Henry Clay. I'm sure Louisa was really thrilled about that.
Yeah.
But finally, at 7:15 p.m. on February 23rd, John Quincy Adams passed away. His funeral ceremonies began in the House chamber. Then his body was escorted to the Congressional Cemetery, where it remained for a few days before 30 members of Congress, one from each state, accompanied it on a train back to Boston. Now, the funeral train stopped at points, quote, to permit local ceremonies, and citizens stood silently in tribute along the route. After 5 days, though, it made its way to Boston on March 10th, but sadly, a rainstorm meant that the outdoor ceremonies that had been planned were canceled. But a memorial tribute at Faneuil Hall was held. The next day, a service was held at First Parish Church, which had been the church home of the Adamses since 1640. Then he was interred for the time being at the family vault at the Quincy Cemetery across the road. But on December 15th, 1852, the remains of both John Quincy and his wife Louisa were reinterred in the vault at First Parish Church, where they still rest with John and Abigail Adams to this day. And Chris, I don't know if you had a chance to go down into the tomb where they're all at.
I didn't. That was the one thing that was that I had to rush around and skip that one bit. But yeah, it's amazing that a life can come in as sort of such a circle. Like, obviously, lots of people do tend to be buried and laid to rest in places that are special to them. But everything was in a very small area.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting. We actually, when we went to visit, figuring the time, we were down in the tomb when the earthquake struck in the D.C. area, the one that the Washington Monument had to be closed for a while. Mm-hmm. We were down in the tomb, and it was actually felt in Boston.
Wow.
So, but we didn't feel anything. But with that, John Quincy Adams passed away, and there is so much that could be said about his legacy. So all the towns, the places named either Adams or Quincy after him, the aforementioned Adams National Historical Park, buildings and institutions named after him, his depiction in numerous TV series and movies. It just goes on and on. But I did want to talk about a couple of legacy items before we evaluate. Mm-hmm. So, as those who study the Adams family know, he would not be the last member of the family to serve in public office. Just to highlight a few, his son, Charles Francis Adams, got involved in elected office and served in the U.S. House of Representatives starting in 1859 until he was appointed by President Lincoln as U.S. Minister to Great Britain. He would serve in London from 1861 until 1868. And he was also the Free Soil candidate for vice president in 1848. Charles's grandson, Charles Francis Adams III, served as Secretary of the Navy under President Hoover, which means he'll get his own seat at the table series episode.
Cool.
Henry Adams, Charles's son, would become a prominent historian and became close to a man who would later go on to be a prominent Secretary of State, John Hay. Now, another key part of his legacy, particularly for scholars and students of the time period, is his diary. All 15,000 pages of it. Now, because he was such a diligent diarist and involved in so many key moments in American history, we get such great insight from his diary about folks like Henry Clay, Calhoun, as well as on geopolitics and scientific advancements and all the other topics that interested the man dubbed Old Man Eloquent. Mm-hmm. We also get great insights into Adams himself in ways that we don't get from other historical figures. Mm-hmm. Now, we also do have to take some things with a grain of salt because, like all of us, he had his own biases, and especially against folks like, Andrew Jackson. But we will be forever in his debt for this great wealth of insight. But finally, I wanted to share one last quote from Trobe. Quote, "Writing about John Quincy Adams is a way of recovering something vital in American experience, all the more so because it has been obscured by time. Adams represents a defunct evolutionary line in American political life. It is easier for us to recognize his faults than his virtues. But we need his virtues."
Yeah, that's very good.
Very good summary.
So, with that, what are your first thoughts on JQA?
I've learned so much. I feel like I'm going to have stuff to think about for days, and will probably have many moments where I'm like, I should have said this, because there's just, the guy worked from he was about 2 right up until the very end. There's just so much to uncover, and this has been an amazing tour de force. Really, thank you for taking us on it.
Yeah, and I think partly because, I've moved to other countries and I've moved around and learned a different language and stuff like that. I really have an attachment to him as a character. It's quite hard to get with, so long ago in terms of the political side of things, with obviously stuff like slavery and things is easy to pick a side on. But they're always the Federalists and the Democratic Republic. As a British person, for me, it doesn't really matter which side he was on. And it's harder to sort of judge those side of things, but just his life as I don't know, I haven't looked at it, but the side panel on the Wikipedia page must be, this job, this job, this job, this job, but just everything that he managed to see and do is ridiculous.
Yeah, and I also felt like that made him very relatable. Like you were saying, we have both moved to other countries and learned to speak new languages. I also, without sounding too preposterous, relate to him and Louisa's life together a little bit through you and me. We've not had nearly as interesting a life. I mean, we haven't traversed Europe in winter whilst the Napoleonic Wars were going on, but we have built a life where we support each other's careers and move to new places and set up that kind of life. So in a small way, that's something that I can personally relate to both of them. And then also the huge tragedies of their, whatever medical situation was ailing her, it sounds like, with difficult pregnancies and stillbirths and difficult births. Just can't imagine what that must have been like.
I think if any president was going to have a podcast, it would be him, like his own, hosting it instead of doing a diary. He would
yes.
and the first few seasons, it would be anonymous as like anonymous podcast, and then it would come out.
Do you really think so? You think he would have been public?
No, I think
like
he might
that?
save them and then publish them all after he died.
Yeah.
It would have been interesting, but yes, I could see him having a podcast and talking about all of these different subjects that he was interested in, and then picking up the debates of the day and giving his points of view, and of course being controversial because he would take a contrarian point of view to what most everybody else was seeing, but he would have a reason for it. It would be something in his mind that, it would be amazing.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's interesting what you say. He was his own man. And I wrote here in my notes, was that also because he was able to be so? To some extent, he was born with that famous silver spoon in his mouth. And could he afford to be this one-man political party, especially when he became the aging statesman? It's he had a base to stand on, so to say.
Absolutely. And that's the thing, he didn't have to rise through, which, and this gets into, our first category, the whole picture, where we look at his overall career and character. And of course, we can award up to 10 points, but he didn't have to go necessarily seeking political office. It was just, hey, you're John Adams' son. Let's put you forward.
Yeah, and he maybe didn't have to seek the alliances and things like that would be necessary maybe for a career politician from a different background. So points out of 10.
Yeah, because this is like you said, this is the whole career that he's doing, which, I mean, it's... I think he did nothing, so it's probably a 0. But
in this abbreviated version, there was nothing. He did nothing.
This Cliff Notes version of his life.
And I think that's something we should note. There are other examples in just history in general, but in American history, of folks getting to a position because of their name and failing, doing nothing.
Definitely.
And he definitely didn't do that.
Yeah, we listened to actually a really good Swedish history podcast about was it the Charge of the Light Brigade, and about how all the British officers just bought their military commissions, turned up and said, "Oh, which way round do you point the gun?" And just sort of, "Oh no, we seem to have lost the war." And just they didn't do anything to deserve their positions, and then did nothing with it. Whereas he was obviously educated and could fulfill the positions, but that was because of partly because of his upbringing and stuff. But I mean, it's hard to...
It's got to be 8, 9, 10. I think I might say... I might knock 1 point off because, like I say, he was able to do certain things. It's easier for someone like him to be contrarian and strike out on his own in his opinions than it perhaps would have been for someone else. But it's still just also the language skills, English isn't my first language. So, just learning to speak this was tough. So, 1 point for learning ancient Greek and Dutch. So I think it's what do you say, Chris?
Yeah, I mean, it's, he was successful, like we sort of mentioned, or you mentioned. They weren't the most taxing of diplomatic posts at some points. One of them is sort of in the Netherlands when it sort of isn't even really a country a bit, where it's being just run by France. So it's the sort of success versus the amount of stuff that you do. It's just, he's got like a machine gun that's just come. He's just doing so much stuff. But then, he becomes the president and he then goes into Congress, and he was offered to join the Supreme Court and stuff. So, I mean, I think I'd struggle to not give a 10.
Yeah. I'm going to settle on a 9.
Well, if you go 9, I might go 10.
Okay. So since we have 2 guests, I'm combining your scores and taking half. So that's a 9.5 combined from both of you. I'm going to go with a 9.5 as well, just because, I mean, there is so much there. He did so much. And also, like you said, it was like from the time he was 2, he was in some kind of service until he literally died on the job. So, he definitely, but I think a little needs to come off just because he didn't always succeed. I mean, he lost the presidency after 1 term. He had some setbacks, some failures, but overall, I mean, you can't get much better than this in terms of an overall career. He had so much that he did and that he was able to accomplish and succeed in. But now let's zoom in on his time in the cabinet with our go-getter round. This round looks at the impact of the cabinet member during their time in the cabinet. And again, we can each award up to 10 points.
I mean, so the Monroe Doctrine is one of the few things about American history from this period that I remember that we studied in school. Like when I was in what is the equivalent of high school here, you have this year or 2 semesters on world history, where like when you get to the couple of weeks that you do the US, it's like they became independent, then some stuff, then they had a civil war, then like boom, World War II happens, and like it's very superficial US history because it's crammed in a course that at least back then was called world history. So they had a lot to teach us. But remember, we studied the Monroe Doctrine and this idea of US expansions, and I'm just thinking it's misnamed. It should have been called the John Quincy Adams Doctrine, because it's actually him doing it.
Yeah, and that's interesting. And then it is also interesting compared to sort of, I've done 3 and a bit pages of just one word notes, and not much of it is from the Secretary of State time when you look at the whole career. So there's not as much there, but then there's the whole like this with Florida and the islands of Florida, and how the repatriation of enslaved people back to Africa that he didn't want to do, but then at the same time he's thinking slavery is more of a moral and not a political thing at this point, and then it changes later on. So, and then he wants, like we said, he wants to fill in the map. It's not like as you said, it worked well because he had a good working relationship with the president. I think it would have been interesting if he had to have more initiative and was like crowbarring in his own ideas and really driving the agenda. He's driving it to a certain extent because he's doing it in partnership with someone else, but he's not necessarily sort of like grabbing it and doing everything himself. But it's still positive in the sense that he gets stuff done. You can debate whether the stuff that he got done was positive or and stuff like that. But I don't know. It's definitely not a screaming a 10 or a 9 or something, but I don't know, maybe a 6 or something that's like decently positive.
I was going to go higher because, the Monroe Doctrine, it's such a, to me, defining thing in American history. Maybe because it was one of the few things we studied about it and his role in that. I think a smudge on his record is this where he said nothing can be done to stop the tidal wave of Western influence on behalf of the native people. And you're like, yes, John Quincy Adams, literally you could have stopped that.
Yeah.
Like,
just stop.
if you wanted to, you could have come out with a different position. So that's a bit of a mark against his character, that he seems to just be like, nah, this is bound to happen.
Because he wanted the map.
Yeah, and we as a government can't do anything about it. And you're like, yes, you definitely can if you wanted to. So I think I'm going to go an 8.
Yeah, well, I think because then it's going to be split between the two of us. I think if you then go for an 8 and I go for a 6, I think that probably judges roughly what we think collectively.
So that gives him a 7 from both of you. And so for me, one of the things that, the Monroe Doctrine, the fact that he basically won that argument and set the course of, this doctrine is still talked about today regularly in politics. It's still seen as being something viable. So that is important. Also, the fact that he had such a large influence within the cabinet, we've already seen in Crawford's episodes, but we'll see in Calhoun's, they had a large influence as well, but Adams was definitely a leading figure. I won't necessarily say that he was the top person in the cabinet. At times he would lose the debate, but he still was seen as being a major influence. And so I think for that, I think I'm going to go with an 8 for him, which brings this total up to 15, and he has 34 points overall. But now we get to our hot seat round. This round discusses any disgraceful behavior of or actions committed by the cabinet member, but this disgrace does not have to be during their tenure of office in the cabinet. And we can take away up to 10 points, so negative 10 from each of us.
So this is my issue with him. On our podcast, Kingdom, we have a similar category. We call it Swedish sin. And, it is fun and entertaining, especially because you don't live under the direct influence of these people's policies and actions, because they're so far removed from us in history. In that respect, I want them to do crazy stuff. I want them. We have sort of medieval Swedish kings that have, sexual relations with nuns and kill bears when they're drunk. And, that's deplorable behavior. I don't condone it, but I find it entertaining when we do the podcast. And frankly, there's not much with John Quincy Adams that I find entertaining. I can't laugh at him. And that's obviously because he's a very good both person and politician, but I don't know.
Yeah, I think the sort of the scandalous things are more, they're linked a lot to political decisions, and so then it's not necessarily as personal. Some of them do fall a little bit on the personal side, but then I think the big turn, even with the caveats to being so anti-slavery and stuff afterwards, sort of would take away or re-give him any points that I would then take away for any scandal or stuff. So I'm struggling to think.
Yeah,
It's a bit boring to say don't take any away, but I'm struggling to think of any major things apart from the original saying, slavery is a moral thing, it's not political, let's just not talk about it. That was a view of loads of people, and then he changed his mind so dramatically later on.
Yeah, and similarly with his attitude of expansionism on behalf of native communities. It's not. Had he sort of killed a Russian bear with his bare hands in front of the
with his bare hands
with the bear's own hands in front of the Tsarina, whilst in Moscow, that's what you want in quotation marks.
And
scandal. I don't.
And
know.
There's nothing at all with his relationship with his wife. There's some questionable parenting decisions with his children, maybe not coming or coming on trips and stuff, but that's small fry. And all the he has fun with people on his trips, that's way before he's married and everything. So
yeah.
Well, and even some of the more controversial, and I think we do need to acknowledge the native peoples, he did set policy, even though he was we don't really want to do this, but we've just got to expand. That is something that did have an impact.
Yeah.
But other things, I did find, apparently in November 1841, he delivered remarks, and this was the time when the Opium War was happening. So Britain was trying to force the opium trade on China, and China was saying, no, we don't want our people addicted to opium. It's breaking down our society. And John Quincy Adams delivered this speech in which he said the British were right, and that countries shouldn't have a right to say that, folks can't trade with them. We need free trade. And it was really more about the free trade part for him than about the opium.
Yeah.
But it was still you're advocating for opium to be forced on people by gunpoint. That's not a good look, but it also didn't really have any impact besides, folks were what is this guy saying?
So I don't know, maybe a 1 for the Native American things from me.
Yeah, I was going to say a 1 as well, because it could be argued that there's such a thing as passive guilt. If you don't actively correct,
for sure,
mistakes or deplorable actions, then you're part of the problem. But the lack of bear killings and illicit affairs with
anyone,
it just doesn't register high on the.
So I think a 1 from us both, giving a 1 overall is probably fair.
Yeah.
Well, and I will give him a little more. I'm going to take away 1.5 points, just because the dealings with native peoples, but then also just this constant push for westward expansion and the expansion of the nation. And we know that had detrimental effects, even though it was highly popular at the time. He wasn't doing anything. There weren't many people who were oh, well, let's don't expand, but it's still, we know the impact of it. So, but still beyond that, there's not really much there. So we're only taking away 2.5 points, which has him at 31.5. But now he's got an opportunity to pick up some more points, because we go into tenure of office. And this is the entire time that the cabinet member served in a full-time capacity in the cabinet. He served for 8 years. His dates were September 22nd, 1817 to March 3rd, 1825. We round here, and so he gets 8 points. And then we get to our bonus points. So he could get a bonus point if he served in more than one full-time cabinet position. He didn't. He was just Secretary of State. If he had served as a full-time cabinet member in more than one presidential administration, well, he couldn't do that because he became the president. So
technically he was, just not.
He didn't get that point, but he does get a point because he did become president. So he at least gets one bonus point, which means that John Quincy Adams ends with 40.5 points.
Mm.
But the points don't matter because I've got to ask y'all, after all I've shared in this abbreviated version of this individual's life and career, what we've discussed, do you think that John Quincy Adams is notable enough or impactful enough to earn a seat at the table of the Cabinet All-Stars?
I mean, he built the table and the chair that he sat on. So it's and also I know I made fun of his filing system. Like, first of all, as a Nordic person and our famous love of order and structure, a filing system is not to be poo-pooed at. I appreciate a good filing system and I appreciate state efficiency. So also that he just kind of both literally and figuratively built a system in these roles, like literally moved the offices and all that. That is also to his credit. So.
And I think it's interesting because obviously we wait for your series on his presidency, but with him being only a one-term president, and there's obviously plenty of stuff there that will be really interesting, but there can't be too many. Like, if you could count Washington because of the War of Independence and stuff, there can't be many presidents who the rest of their life is probably even more interesting than their actual presidency and the life of some of it, not even when they're in the cabinet, but it's amazing. Just the journey of him as a human being is ridiculous, really.
Yeah, you can kind of like play with the thought of, what if he'd fallen on an ice patch when he was in Stockholm, age 13, and
fell for a lake and passed away then what would have happened?
Yeah. And just I genuinely think, even with my limited knowledge of US history, you get the feeling that the US would be a different country had John Quincy Adams slipped and hit his head on the ice in Stockholm in the late 1700s. So definitely a seat at the table. Like I said, he built the table and his own chair. So.
and the filing system of all the papers in front of him.
With a cabinet as well. So I would agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think if he doesn't earn it, who does? It's... And from every way you look at it, if you look at it through his overall career, if you look at it through his time in the cabinet, he was a pivotal figure of the Monroe administration. He was a pivotal figure in American history. And so I think it's got to be a yes. So congratulations, John Quincy Adams. You may have only won one term, but you at least have a seat at the table to go to in your retirement, or your retirement that you never really retired in.
Sort of like he's lying there half dying. He's like, I'm going to retire now. 30 minutes later. So, well, that was short.
I mean, this has been such a pleasure, Jerry, because last time we came on, we did quite an obscure figure. I remember I kind of championed that at least one high school should be named in his honor.
And I just remember, like, the thing I remember the most was was it Senator Horsey? So
it wasn't even him.
Senator Horsey.
And so far, I've not heard from any U.S. high schools saying that they renamed themselves. So we did a very obscure character, and that was loads of fun. And now we've done, like I said, even when Swedish high school kids are taught a perfunctory, surface level US history, we heard of this guy. So we've done the big guys and the small guys, and it's always so educational and so enjoyable to listen to you and come on the podcast. So thank you so much.
Yeah, massive thank you.
Well, and thank you to y'all for coming on for a great conversation, for this lengthy, abbreviated life and career of John Quincy Adams. But I cannot thank you enough. And most especially, I cannot thank you enough for your friendship. And, that's one of the things about podcasting that I didn't know coming in is how many close friendships I would form because of that. And I'm so grateful to y'all. I'm so grateful to the perspective that you bring always when you come on, but then also all the work you do on your podcast. And I highly encourage, they are on my regular rotation. So I encourage our listeners, if you haven't already, listen to A Flat Pack History of Sweden and Kingdom. So Elsa and Chris, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you again. I don't want to just repeat everything you just said, but the same back to you. Thank you.
And thank you so much to our listeners. We greatly appreciate you joining us for this. And until next time, stay safe and healthy, be kind to one another, and take care, dear friends.